Welcome. This is Dr. Owen Anderson, and we're finishing part 12 of Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. In part 11, at the end, we saw Demea leave. Demea, who represents the Orthodox believer, had thought that he's working with Philo, the mystic, and that Philo's mysticism would help protect the belief in God. So from the beginning, Demea was arguing that God is incomprehensible. And Philo the mystic said something similar, and so he thought they're going along together. But then Philo, and the whole time Cleanthes was warning Demea, you're being tricked. And that comes out here at the end, when Philo concludes that God is amoral. And Demea says, wait. I allied myself with you in order to prove the incomprehensible nature of the divine being. But instead, he finds Philo agreeing with all the views of libertines and infidels and betraying the holy cause. So Demea leaves the discussion. Now, the other possibility for him, he's basically silenced. He's shut down with these arguments, has no response. The other alternative is to get in there and show why he thinks these arguments are unsound. But this is not an uncommon response of the fideist in the face of the skeptic. The fideist initially thinks the skeptic is an ally, and then it turns out that they're not. Now, Cleanthes has wanted to give an argument to show that God exists, but the framework he operates within, empiricism, ends up with something more like a superhero, a being not unlike us, just a little more powerful, but not infinite. So that's not satisfactory to Demea either. So we come to part 12. After Demea's departure, Cleanthes and Philo continue the conversation. And Cleanthes says, I prefer to reason with you, Philo, or with Demea alone. So this is the key piece, reason. They're not simply sharing their feelings and opinions. It's not share time. It is reasoning together time, which means that you're offering what you think is a sound argument, and the other person has a chance to either give a rebuttal or agree it's a sound argument. So that's what's going on here, and that's why that's really the way to have knowledge. When you know something, you have a sound argument. And if you don't have a sound argument, then you don't know. He identifies Philo here as a spirit of controversy, liking to engage in controversial topics, and a hatred of common superstition. Common superstition. I don't know how much you may not be superstitious, or if you are, you may not realize that what you think is superstition. But this was a big advancement in human history, to go beyond superstition and begin to actually investigate the world and get to know how it works. So we could say, yeah, I kind of agree with Philo on that point. Now, I must admit, replied Philo, that I'm less cautious on the subject of natural religion than any other, both because I know that I can never corrupt the principles concerning religion of any man of common sense. So here he's going to say there's certain common sense beliefs we all share. Even if we don't know them, we can't give an argument for them. It's common sense, you might say. And also because I'm confident that no one who sees me as a man of common sense will ever misunderstand my intention. So, okay, now we're going to get more of Philo's view, not just his attacking, but what does he think common sense is? Because the reality is, different people have different understandings of common sense. It doesn't really solve problems, right? If you're in a dispute with someone and you say to them, just use common sense, they probably won't automatically say, oh, okay, good point, I'll just do that. They probably think they already are using common sense. So he says, no one of himself, no one has a deeper sense of religion impressed on his mind than I do, or offers more profound adoration to the divine being as he reveals himself to our reason in the inexplicable design and artfulness of nature. So this is a key sentence. He's really appealing here to general revelation, to what has also been called the light of nature, reason, and to creation. So he spent the better part of the dialogue showing how Cleanthes' argument from design fails. So what on earth could he mean at this point? Now, some people jump in here and they say, this is Philo's problem, is he doesn't have the scriptures. He doesn't use the Bible. He just uses reason. But does he really? Perhaps he doesn't even use reason. So let's look into that. The most careless, the most stupid thinker sees everywhere a purpose, intention, a design, and no man can be so hardened in absurd systems as to reject that at all times. So again, remind yourself of what he said earlier. The analogies that Cleanthes were using were coming short of getting to God. And yet he says he doesn't say here it's common sense, but he just spoke of common sense. And now he's speaking of everyone believes this. Everyone believes that there is purpose and intention. It'd be absurd to reject this. Now, he'd also given ways to explain that were non-personal. So let's keep going here and see what it says. That nature does nothing in vain is a maxim established in all the universities merely on the strength of observing the works of nature without any religious purpose. And from a firm conviction of its truth, an anatomist who had observed a new organ or canal in an animal body would never be satisfied until he had also discovered what it does and what it is for. So there is a fittingness in nature between parts. What does that prove? Let's wait and see what he says. But when you look at nature, trees don't just make leaves, they make them for a purpose, right? And everything in nature is like that. So when you go out and you discover something, you can ask yourself, how does this fit in? And the answer is never, oh, it doesn't. It's an uncaused event. It does fit in somewhere. You may not know how yet, but it fits in, and people know that. One great foundation of the Copernican system is the maxim that nature acts by the simplest methods and chooses the proper means to in the end. So this might be kind of like a beginning unproven point that you start with. This has also been called Occam's razor. Nature acts by the simplest method. So in contrast to the Ptolemaic system of astrology, where you have circles and loops going everywhere to explain planetary motion, cycles within cycles, Copernican system is very simple. Each planet orbits the sun, and it got refined by Kepler, because Copernicus used actual circular orbits, which the planets don't have. They have oval orbits. And Kepler adds that to it to explain some of the discrepancies in the Copernican system. So this he calls the foundation. And that really is what we want to find. What is the foundation on which we build our knowledge? The foundational truths. He says this is the foundation of all piety and religion. And realizing this design, purpose, intention, nature. And then he speaks of the Greek physician Galen. Reason concerning the human body, the anatomy of man, he says, reveals more than 600 different muscles. And anyone who finds these will find that in each of them, nature must have taken into account at least 10 different circumstances. So he names those here for each muscle. I would suspect we may have found more since then as we are able to do more precise measurements. So that in the muscles alone, there are more than 6,000 different plans. And he calculates 284 bones. The structure of each of these aims at more than 40 purposes. What an enormous display of planning in the human body. Now imagine how much that's added to by DNA. Galen had no understanding of the microscopic world. Imagine each cell going about doing its thing, reading the DNA map to produce proteins. And now you're in the billions, not thousands, all designed around the functioning of the body, and that's just the human body. So as we go further in these researches, we discover new scenes of skill and wisdom, but we can tell that further down the smallest scale, there are yet other things beyond our perceptual reach and fine internal structure of the parts. So that's getting into my DNA, which he didn't know about then. All these devices are repeated in every different species of animal. And if Galen's irreligion couldn't withstand such striking appearances, even when these natural sciences were still imperfect, a scientist today must indeed be stubbornly obstinate. If he can doubt, there is a supreme intelligence. That's really interesting, right? Here we have speaking about modern science and how obstinate a person would be as calling themselves a scientist. In other words, have you ever heard this before? Follow the science. Is that a popular saying right now? So Philo would say, follow the science to the supreme intelligence. Now, if I met with this sort, thank God they're very rare, one of these obstinate types, I would ask him, supposing there were a God who didn't reveal himself immediately to our senses, enabling us to see or feel him, could he possibly give stronger proofs of his existence than the proofs that do appear on the whole face of nature? So this is a good question for us. Here's Philo. Now, the way we prove each other exists is in that first sense of an immediate appearance to our senses. When I come in the room, I take a mental roll call in my mind by looking around. And so if someone was to say, is this student here? And they give a name, I could look around and say, oh, yes, they are. So I wouldn't use that method to tell you if God is in the room. Is God in attendance today? Oh, why, yes, he is. Yeah, she's right there. So how would we prove it? And so someone might say, because of that, we only have very weak proofs. And that's because the person who says that is an empiricist who only thinks that we know things with our senses. But of course, many of the most important things that we know, we can't see. So he says, this is the strongest proof possible, which is creation itself proves there must be what he calls a supreme intelligence. What indeed could such a divine being do but copy the present arrangements of things, makes many of his artifices so obvious that no stupidity could mistake them, and provide glimpses of still greater artifices that demonstrate his prodigious superiority above our narrow minds, and conceal a great many of them altogether from such imperfect creatures. Now, according to all rules of sound reasoning, every factual proposition counts as indisputable when it is supported by all the arguments that its nature admits of. So that's interesting because it kind of tells us there that there are different arguments for different settings, which is right. And if you have a proposition which is indisputable, it's because you've given a sound argument to show that. He says, no human imagination can compute the number of the arguments, and no understanding can take in how strong they are. I shall add, said Cleanthes, to what you have so well urged, that one great advantage of the principle of theism is that it's the only system of cosmogony that can be made intelligible and complete, while also preserving throughout a strong analogy to what we see and experience in the world every day. So his argument now for theism is it connects up with what we see going on. Now, I think this is going to be a problem for him because other people think that about their non-theistic beliefs. So this won't actually solve any disputes. He'll just say, my view fits up with the world. Well, no, my view does. And that gets back to the weakness of his appeal to common sense. not recognizing how common sense can differ because of assumptions. So the comparison of the universe to a machine or human body is so obvious and natural and is justified by so many examples that it must immediately occur to all unprejudiced minds and win universal approval. Now, even if it did that, universal approval doesn't guarantee knowledge also. People could be universally wrong. That does happen. So whoever wants to weaken this theory can't claim to succeed by establishing in its place any other that is precise and determinative, for there is no such rival. It is sufficient for him if he raises doubts and difficulties, and by remote and abstract views of things reaches the suspense of judgment. So a skeptic might say, I can't prove some other theory, but I can't believe this one. I'll suspend belief. But he says that state of mind is unsatisfactory. You can't maintain that. You're going to have to believe something. Human nature is capable, through force of prejudice, of obstinately persevering in a false, absurd system. But I think it's absolutely impossible to maintain or defend having no system at all. So you're going to have to believe something. And this is the universal recommendation of our experience, according to Cleanthes. And Philo jumps in then too. Now, earlier, he'd been called a Pyrrhonian skeptic, and that kind of skepticism precisely says this. Just don't believe anything, because you can't know. So we have to figure Philo out here in part 12. He seems to be reversing himself. And now all of a sudden he's saying, yeah, I don't have any respect for suspending judgment about the existence of God. I suspect this is more of a verbal dispute than is usually imagined. That the works of nature are very like the products of human ingenuity is evident. Well, again, he'd said earlier it isn't. And according to all the rules of good reasoning, we ought to infer, if we argue at all about them, that their causes are correspondingly alike. Now, that was Cleanthes' view. But as there are also considerable differences between the works of nature and human products, we have reason to suppose that their causes are correspondingly unalike. Now it sounds like Philo. And then in particular, we ought to attribute a much higher degree of power and energy to the supreme cause than to any we have ever observed in mankind. Especially this. If it was just a matter of organizing, then you'd say, yeah, that's a lot more intelligent than us. But God isn't just organizing stuff that already exists. God is bringing it into existence from not having existed. That's really the highest power there is. That's what we call infinite power. You can't get more powerful than that. Humans can't do that. We just reorganize stuff that already exists into new forms. God brings things into existence, which is a whole different level. So here then, the existence of a God is plainly discovered by reason. But we have this verbal problem of what does he mean by God? And if there's a question as to whether these analogies entitle us to call him a mind or intelligence, that was what he raised questions about earlier, given the vast difference that can reasonably suppose to exist between him and human minds. What is this but a mere verbal controversy? No man can deny the likeness between the effects. To hold back from inquiring about the causes is scarcely possible. So you see something that's designed and has purpose, and you know that in human artifice, that means there was a human, a mind involved. So too, you think there must be a mind involved here. So if we aren't contented with calling the first and supreme cause only a God or deity, but want to find other words to apply to him, what can we call him but mind or thought, given that he is justly supposed to bear a considerable resemblance to mind? So he's not the material stuff, because we're asking where the material stuff come from. So he's not, you can't say, well, from material stuff. You're asking where that come from. You're getting to an eternal mind. Has always existed. Now, all sensible people are annoyed by verbal disputes. You should avoid disputes over word. They're harmful. and these occur often in philosophical and theological inquiries. And it's found that the only remedy for this misuse of language comes from clear definitions. It's clear what is meant by God and what is not meant by God. From the precision of ideas that enter into any argument, and from strictly keeping to the meanings of the terms one uses. So precision and meaning. But there is one sort of controversy which, from the very nature of language and of human ideas, is involved in perpetual ambiguity and can never, by any precaution or any definitions, reach a reasonable certainty or precision. All right, so there's going to be one thing here we can't know about. These are the controversies about the degree of any quality or circumstance. Was Hannibal great or very great? How beautiful was Cleopatra? What term of praise is Livy or Thucydides entitled to? So men may agree to all eternity about such questions without ever settling the matter. So we would agree Hannibal is great, but we could argue all day about how great. And you might say he's top 3 ever. I say top 5, and we're bitter enemies. And that's how it is in religion. Someone will say, no, really super great. Now, the problem with this is that you can't get greater than bringing into being. So it isn't so much that God's super great as God's infinite. This is not one of the examples he considers, though. He's almost more arguing about Plato's demiurge, a being that coexists with matter from eternity and organizes it. Did he do a great job or a decent job? But again, this doesn't sound like Philo from earlier. Earlier, Philo said the world is so poorly managed that if you didn't believe in God at all and you came into this world, you would never start believing in God. So we need to reconcile these, and you wonder, is he playing with Cleanthes right now? Is he playing with his audience who wants to hear these things? Hume's smart enough that he's not going to just have a direct contradiction in his character, so we'll have to figure out what's the author doing. The slightest inquiry reveals that the dispute concerning theism is of this nature and is consequently merely verbal. So we'll have to look into that and see. Are the disputes about either theism and atheism or between theists merely verbal? There are a lot of verbal disputes in life. And people get really worked up about them, and you have to learn to have patience and try to take time to sort them out. And there's he says, incurably ambiguous. That not only are they verbal disputes, you can't even get past them. That would be too bad. So I asked the theist if he doesn't agree that the difference between the human mind and the divine mind is great, and because it is incomprehensible, immeasurable. And the more pious he is, the readier he will agree. That was Demean. So yeah, it's so different. We're completely different. And the more he will be disposed to magnify the difference. But I turn to the atheist, who I say is only nominally an atheist and can't possibly be seriously so. So he, read that again. I turn to the atheist, who's only nominally an atheist and can't seriously be so. There aren't any serious atheists. Is he being silly, or is he being serious about that? You could read it both ways. People have read it both ways. That he's worried about religious censure at the time, so he has to say stuff like that. But he's given other reasons to say, yeah, atheism denies common sense. And so you'd have to deny common sense, which is not serious. And I ask him whether, judging by the coherence and apparent coordination among all the parts of this world, there isn't a certain similarity among all the operations of nature, whether it's a rotting turnip, coming into existence of an animal, the structure of human thought, are not energies that probably bear some remote analogy to each other, and he can't possibly deny it. He will readily acknowledge it. Look what's happened to the word God at this point. So it went from, in the first part, some great intelligence that's so far beyond us we don't understand it, to a kind of vague relationship between the similarities of these things that produces intelligible outcomes. So to say this is a dispute about words is, I think, disingenuous here. You're using the word, you're stretching it so much that you actually have two completely different systems you're describing. An impersonal set of laws or an intelligence. That's not a dispute about words. That's a dispute about content of words. So then he says more to the atheist. I ask him if it isn't likely that the source that first ordered this universe in general and still keeps it in order bears also some remote and hard to grasp analogy to the particular operations of nature, including the arrangements that produce the human mind. Then I ask both of these. So even now, if you look at materialist cosmologists, that they try to explain the origin of the universe through laws of gravity, laws of quantum mechanics. And they try to reconcile these laws. They haven't done that yet, the unifying law. They just have these 5 laws, 5 forces. And these forces bring about orderly outcomes. So that's what he would say, yeah, that's God. Now, that doesn't seem like God for the theist because it's not personal. That's not a dispute over words. That's a dispute over content. Is God personal or impersonal forces? So then he said, I'll ask both of them this. What are you arguing about? The theist allows that the original intelligence is very different from human reason. The atheist allows that the original source of order bears some remote analogy to it. Will you quarrel, gentlemen, about the degrees of difference and of similarity and enter into a controversy that can't be made precise and can't be settled? There it is. So the unity of the character Philo. He's still a skeptic mystic. Earlier, he said, all persons of common sense believe in God due to order. But now we're seeing that this is an incredibly imprecise term. It could be like saying all people of common sense believe in Blick. And then you say, well, what is Blick? Whatever people of common sense believe in. Well, that's a circular argument. Consider then what you're really disagreeing about. Well, I gave the example. Is God a material force or a spirit, personal? That's a big disagreement in the history of thought. And you can't just simply get past it by saying, oh, that's just an argument about words. Well, no, it isn't. And here I must also acknowledge, Cleanthes, that as the works of nature are more like the effects of our skill and planning than they are like the effects of our benevolence and justice, we have reason to infer that God's non-moral attributes have greater resemblance to man than those of his moral attributes. So now Philo's giving his view of God, which is also one that's been contended. God's power, perhaps he'd put wisdom here, non-moral wisdom, are more like ours than are his justice. Because when we look at the world, it's so mismanaged with respect to the problem of evil. We have no idea what's going on. It doesn't fit our ideas of justice and goodness at all. Okay, well, that's not a theistic view of God anymore. Perhaps that's more what is called deism. Now, what follows from that? Only that man's moral qualities are more defective in their kind than his non-moral abilities. So back to his solution to the problem of evil. God is amoral, and we can't know why there's good and evil. For it is agreed that God is absolutely and entirely perfect, so whatever differs most from him departs the furthest from the supreme standard of moral uprightness and perfection. Now, the footnote here adds another thing, that the dispute between skeptics and dogmatists is entirely verbal, or is especially about how much to doubt. We have either doubt or assurance. Do we have knowledge or just strongly held opinions? But I've suggested where, no, there's actually real content difference going on here. And that would affect what we can know and have assurance about. So these, Cleanthes, are my undisguised views on this subject, and you know that I have upheld and value them for a long time. But my veneration for true religion, which I'm not sure what that would be for him, given what he said of God, is matched by an abhorrence of common superstitions. And I admit that I get a special pleasure out of pushing superstitions, sometimes into absurdity, sometimes into impiety. All bigots hate impiety more than they do absurdity. But as you are well aware, they are often equally guilty of both. So what he likes to do as a philosopher is expose superstitious bigots. They think that they're pious and religious, and they're not really. My inclination, replied Cleanthes, lies in a different direction. Religion, however corrupted, is still better than no religion at all. The doctrine of a future state is so strong and necessary a security to morals that we never ought to abandon or neglect it. So interestingly here, for religion, he simply means there's a future state that is shaped by your behavior in this life. That's religion. Finite and temporary rewards and punishments have such a great effect as we daily find them that they do. How much greater must be expected from rewards and punishments that are infinite and eternal? So you can motivate people in this life with rewards. Finish this and get an A, and then we'll give you a free iPhone. Ooh, I'm gonna work hard on that one. But how much the more so if you get either an infinite reward or punishment? That's what religion's about. If common superstition is good for society, said Philo, then how does it happen that history is so full of accounts of its pernicious effects on public affairs? So now they're shifting into an argument. Is any superstition better than no superstition? And Philo's going to say, no, not at all. There's some examples of really horrendous harms on public affairs by superstition. Factions, civil wars, persecutions, subversions of government, oppression, slavery. These are all the dismal consequences which always accompany a prevalence of superstition. Whenever a historical narrative mentions the religious spirit, we're sure to find later in the story some details of the miseries that come with it. No period of time can be happier or more prosperous than those in which the religious spirit is never honored or heard of. So, all right, what is religion then? But, said Cleanthes, the reason for this is obvious. The proper role of religion is to regulate the hearts of men, humanize their conduct, infuse the spirit of temperance, order, and obedience. When religion calls attention to itself and acts as a separate motive force, puts itself into a public role, that's when problems come up. Just keep religion private. And that's really been the solution we've relied on for the last few centuries, isn't it? Your religion's your private matter. Don't bring it into the public sphere. The idea being that whenever that happens, we get big troubles. And so will all religion, except the philosophical and rational kind, said Philo. Your reasonings are easier to escape from than are my facts, because finite and temporary rewards and punishments have so great influence, therefore infinite and eternal ones would have a greater. This reasoning is not sound. Consider, I beg you, how much we care about present things and how little we express for objects as remote and uncertain as rewards or punishments in an afterlife. I mean, that really doesn't motivate people. It's called the Marshmallow Test. You set his child down, you put a marshmallow in front of him, and you say, you can either eat this now or sit here for 30 minutes, don't eat it, and you'll get 2 marshmallows. There was a study, I don't know if this guy was from Harvard or where, who did this study, and then correlated that to success in life. The kids who can say, I'm not going to eat it now, I'm going to wait 30 minutes, had more success in life. But it's more common that you'll just gobble down the first marshmallow, right? You can't sit there for 30 minutes staring at a marshmallow. So you could do that. You can either have the sensual lusts of this life now or heaven later. People will gobble down the sensual pleasures of this life, right? They don't care about heaven later. They'll have some last minute plan. I'll get extra credit right at the end. God will give out extra credit, Simon, and I'll avoid hell. So you got preachers out there talking about this, he says, and it doesn't have much of an effect. And that was when church attendance was probably much higher than it is now. Now people don't even attend church, so they don't even get to hear this. So these people think that the motives, that the effects of religion on society are so powerful that society can't survive without them. But experience shows us that the smallest grain of natural honesty and benevolence has more effect on a man's conduct than the most grandly inflated views suggested by theologians. So some people are just naturally honest, and even just a small amount of that in you will be much more powerful in your life than having heard 1,000 sermons and you don't have that natural honesty. A lot of things in life are like that. We take credit for them, but they just come natural to us. You didn't actually do anything to get that. It's just who you found yourself being. And then something comes easy and you're successful and you say, yeah, I'm a great person. Well, you're not really. You're just doing what came natural. A man's natural inclinations work on him all the time. So he's saying in one way, what's interesting is religion can have no effect or very little effect. But on the other hand, he's saying it has a pernicious effect. Well, you can't really have both. Another advantage that inclination has in the tussle with duty, it brings into play on its side all the sharpness and ingenuity of the mind. And when it is placed in opposition to religious principles, it seeks every method and device for eluding them and nearly always succeeds. So you have a natural inclination to do something. Your mind will work all kinds of ways out to make that happen, right? Whereas if you're told something's your duty, you might go about it in a dry and lifeless manner for a while, but you'll eventually stop. But how much do people let's say you're told you have to go to church every Sunday. People will expend all kinds of mental energy to find excuses for why they don't have to. So what if your natural inclination was to do good? You'd find all kinds of ways to do good. So this is well understood in the world, and only fools would trust a man less because they heard that study of philosophy had given him some speculative doubts with regard to theological subjects. And when we have dealings with a man who makes a great profession of religion and devotion, doesn't this put many sensible people on their guard? I mean, when you meet someone who says, I'm very pious, isn't your first response to be like, I'm not sure I can trust this person? It's funny because that's how Aeneas goes around speaking himself. I am pious Aeneas. Are you though? Like if you were pious, would you say that? So we must further consider that philosophers who cultivate reason and reflection, I wish. He must not have been around philosophers, have less need of such religious motives. So here religion means do your duty in this life, so when you die, you get a good heaven. And he's saying that barely shapes anybody's life. It's not helpful. What's helpful is actually using reason, and we got to agree with him there. I think that's right. Pleas for God's favor are generally understood to be either frivolous observances or rapturous ecstasies or bigoted credulity. And therefore, it'd be worth your time to go through that sentence. What is bigoted credulity? You're favoring your own beliefs. Whatever you believe must be true. We need to go back to ancient times or wander to remote places to find instances of this degeneracy of religion, divorce from morality. Amongst ourselves, some people have been guilty of something atrocious that even the Egyptian and Greek superstitions were not guilty of, namely speaking out explicitly against morality and saying that if one puts the least trust or reliance in morality, one will certainly lose favor with God. That's an odd teaching. We'll hear that come out. It's a twisting, a misunderstanding of saved by grace. Since you're saved by grace, not works, you don't have to work anymore. You can do whatever you want. And even if superstition and fanaticism didn't put itself in direct opposition to morality, it would still have the most pernicious consequences, greatly weakening men's attachment to the natural motives of justice and humanity, diverting attention away from morality. So the best case isn't that someone's told, you have to study for exams. The best case is they naturally love the material and are already studying it and want to keep studying it. And for me to get up here and talk to you over and over about how you've got to study, you've got to be studying, will only affect one or two of you at the most. But if you came into this and you said, I can't wait to learn about arguments about what's real, I wouldn't even have to say anything, right? So we don't need what he says, this religion action driver. It's not very successful. Many religious exercises are begun with seeming fervor, although the person's heart at the times feels cold and apathetic. He gradually acquires a habit of covering up his true feelings. So this kind of religion actually creates hypocrites. I just want heaven. I don't really want to be a good person as defined here, but I want heaven, so I'll do it. And you become a hypocrite. The bad effects of these kind of habits, even in ordinary life, are easy to imagine. And even worse when we think about religion. So steadily and exclusively attending to something as important to oneself as eternal salvation is apt to extinguish one's benevolent feelings and generate a narrow, contracted selfishness. And this is interesting because this is actually a common objection now to evangelical religion. Yeah, it's just teaching you to care about yourself. I'm saved. Maybe the people I care about are saved. And I don't really worry about anything else in the world. Because it's going to go to heck in a handbasket anyway. But I'm saved. I'm out of here. So the motives of common superstition have no great influence on general conduct. Is any maxim in politics more certain and infallible than the one saying that the number and the authority of priests should be confined within very narrow limits, and that the civil magistrate ought never to allow the instruments of his authority to fall into such dangerous hands as those of the priests? There's been this conflict between the civil magistrate and the priests. When they take on too much power for themselves, the civil magistrate is weakened. So if the period of popular religion were as salutary as to society as its defenders say it is, then we should want to have priests everywhere. The universal priesthood of all believers. Maybe that's not a bad idea. We want to say the more priests there are in law and government, the better. So then how does it come about that, in fact, the most that a wise ruler can propose with regard to popular religions is, as far as possible, to make a saving game of it and to prevent their pernicious consequences with regard to society? So even if people are going to be superstitious, you can't exactly get rid of it, but you have to protect society from it. Now, as I'm reading this part, it's reminding me of the Soviets and their approach to all religion. They would add that no religion even shows there is a supreme intelligence. They'd be that kind of atheist he's already talked about. And so they would say all religion, all priesthoods of any kind are harmful to the state because they offer an alternative authority to the state, so they're all to be ended. And you have universal official atheism. Now take care, says Cleanthes, don't push matters too far. Don't allow your zeal against false religion to undermine your reverence for true religion. Don't give up this religious principle, which is the chief, the only great comfort in life. A good afterlife is the only good comfort in this life. The most agreeable reflection the human imagination can possibly suggest is that of genuine theism, which represents us as the workmanship of a being who is perfectly good, wise, and powerful, a being who created us to be happy and who, having implanted in us immeasurable desires for good things, will prolong our existence to all eternity, taking us into an infinite variety of scenes in order to satisfy those desires and make our happiness complete and lasting. That's the most agreeable thing that we can think of. Now, that doesn't make it, even if it is the most agreeable thing, You could raise a question about that. It doesn't make it true. Say, well, all humans were made to believe this. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's incorrect. Maybe we evolved this so we have wishful thinking. That picture of how a person seems to relate to religion, said Philo, is most engaging and alluring. And when the person is a true philosopher, is more than just seeming. So they're saying, yeah, that it seems like that could be true, but an actual philosopher will want to know, is it true? The greater part of mankind live only in appearances. And the terrors of religion commonly prevail over its comforts. It is common knowledge that men never seek help from devotion so readily as when they're dejected with grief. They said that earlier, that suffering is the source of religion for people. If you're going along and nothing's happening in life, you just keep going. But then you're driving after class and someone pulls right in front of you. What do you say when you hit the brakes? Oh God. Suffering appears on the horizon, and the immediate thing out of your mouth is a kind of prayer, right? That's when people get religious. But when men are afflicted by find consolation in religion, so the consolation itself is not an affliction. But Philo says sometimes, but it is natural to imagine that when they apply themselves to the contemplation of those unknown beings, the gods of their religion, they will form a notion of them that is suitable to their own present gloom and melancholy. So even if there is a God, we tend to anthropomorphize God to be like us. Rather than saying we're made in the image of God, we make God into our own image to suit our current needs. And that the image of God as fearsome and predominate over the other images of him. I venture to assert that there has never been a popular religion which represents the state of departed souls in such a way as to make it a good thing from a human point of view, that there should be such a state. So death and the departed aren't presented as completely good, or else everyone would just jump off that cliff. When plain folk try to imagine the afterlife, death intervenes between man's eye and the object, and death is so shocking to nature that it throws gloom on all the religions that lie on the far side of it, or regions, the undiscovered country Hamlet speaks of. Between you and that is this awful thing called death. So it is true that both fear and hope in turn to religion, because both these passions agitate the human mind from time to time, and each of them forms a kind of divinity suitable to itself. But when a man is in a cheerful frame of mind, he is fit for business or company or entertainment of any kind, and he naturally turns his attention to these and doesn't think of religion. It's a good time. I'm not really thinking about religion at all. It's only when suffering comes up that you then start to get religious. You're sick. You might turn to your religion for herbs or tonics that heal you. Yeah, because you're sick, you're suffering. So must it be admitted that terror is the driving force of religion. And a further point, these bouts of excessive, extravagant joy by exhausting the spirits always prepare the way for equal bouts of superstitious terror and dejection. The happiest state of mind is not frenzied joy, but balanced calm. So it's contrary to common sense to be anxious or terrified about what may happen to us in the afterlife on account of some opinion that we have, or to imagine that the freest use of our reason will run into any risk in the hereafter. So if you can't really know what's going to happen to you, it's against common sense to be worried about it now. A meteorite might strike me in the head when I go to the parking lot. I mean, I don't know. Are you spending time on that? You're really worried about that? Like, I wear an iron helmet everywhere I go because a meteorite might strike me. Don't even know if that'll help you. But what kinds of things do you spend your time worrying about? So to know God, says Seneca, is to worship him. All other worship, that is, all worship that goes beyond expressing one's knowledge that God exists, is indeed absurd, superstitious, and even pious. So this is strange, right? You're worshiping God because he is, but you don't know anything about what he is. I mean, I think that equation is right. To know God is to worship God, which means you have to know God. And the more you know about God, the more you're able to worship God. Commonly, superstition pushes God down to a level far below that of mankind and represents him as a capricious demon who exercises his power without reason and without humanity. And that does seem to be true. Sometimes I'll ask a person who says they're an atheist, well, what do you think God is? And they just don't have an idea, right? They'll represent kind of this mean grandfather in the sky who's always grumpy and steps on people that get in his way. So if God were inclined to be offended at the vices and follies of silly mortals who are his own workmanship, and the devotees of most popular superstitions would be in for a very bad time. That might be one of your favorite sentences. If God actually is inclined to be offended by what humans do, Philo says he's not, he's amoral. But even if you were inclined, then the hypocrites in religion would be the first on the list. None of the human race would deserve his favor, except for a very few, and those are the philosophical theists, who have suitable, not true, suitable notions of his divine perfections. And the only persons entitled to his compassion and leniency would be the philosophical skeptics. So the philosophical atheists would get, or theists would get his favor. The philosophical skeptics would get his leniency, because it's really hard to know, and they're doing the best they can. And this brings us back to the original point of this whole dialogue, the role of natural theology in education. If the whole of natural theology, as some people seem to maintain, boils down to one simple proposition, though somewhat ambiguous or at least undefined, is this: the cause or causes of order in the universe probably bear some remote analogy to human intelligence. Everyone's okay with that sentence, he says. The theist is okay with it. The atheist is okay with it. Everything else is a dispute over words that we can never reconcile. Now, I'm not sure what kind of worship this would elicit from people. And it doesn't seem that the disputes that come up beyond that are really just disputes over words. If this proposition can't be extended, varied, or explained in more detail, if it yields no inference that affects human life, or can be the source of any action or forbearance from acting, and if the analogy, imperfect as it is, extends only to human intelligence and can't plausibly be transferred to the other qualities of the mind, if all this really is the case, what can the most curious, thoughtful, and religious man do except give a plain philosophical assent to propositions as often as it comes up, and to believe that the arguments on which it is based outweigh the objections against it? Even this we may not know, but our arguments for it seem more persuasive than the arguments against it. He will naturally feel somewhat unnerved by the greatness of the object, by the thought of the cause of the universe. And that greatness will keep him in humble skepticism, Philo says. But believe me, Cleanthes, the most natural feeling that a well-disposed mind will have on this occasion is a longing desire and expectation that God will be pleased to remove, or at least to lessen, this profound ignorance by giving mankind some particular religion, revealing the nature, attributes, and operations of the divine object on our faith. So in the end, what he says is, natural theology is so vague, it only gives us this principle, and all we can do is hope that God gives us special revelation, scripture, to help explain more about who he is. A person who has a sound sense of the imperfections of natural reason. Now he's attacking reason itself. Natural reason is so imperfect, will eagerly reply to revealed truth. Now here's a problem. You use reason to study creation, but you also use reason to study scripture. So if reason is fallible in studying creation, it's also fallible in studying scripture. So to be a philosophical skeptic is, in the man of letters, the first and most essential step towards being a sound, believing Christian, a proposition which I would willingly recommend to the attention of Pamphilus, and I hope Cleanthes will forgive me for interposing so far in the education and instruction of his pupil. Because remember, this is a letter written by the student to a friend about this dialogue. Answering now this question, what's the role of natural theology in education? And you say, saying very little. We just really don't know anything. Cleanthes and Philo did not pursue this conversation much further, and nothing ever made greater impression on me that of all the reasonings on that day. So I confess that on carefully looking over the whole conversation, I cannot help but think that Philo's principles are more probable than Demea's, but that those of Cleanthes approach still nearer to the truth. So for us, it puts us in the same analysis. That's his analysis. But how do we analyze these three? Did we come out knowing anything more? Perhaps we saw that there are some unsound arguments given to show God exists. Do they really exhaust all the kinds, or are there other arguments which do show that it's clear that God exists? And what are the implications for Cleanthes, who would say that God is just a finite but greater being, or Demea, who would say God's so incomprehensible, is not even going to continue the discussion, or Philo, who would say we just have this vague principle, and so if we're going to find any knowledge, we have to go to revealed religion. If none of them in their three approaches can provide a foundation for knowledge, none of the other conclusions they draw will be sound. So my analysis is, as we leave this, a greater prompting to find what they called the foundation for knowledge, so that we can indeed know God, and that this equation from Seneca was right. To know God is to worship God. If you knew God, you would worship God. You're not worshiping God, therefore you don't know God. And fill that out. The end of Hume's dialogues.